Hello and welcome to the Egg on Air live session with Greg Nelson. I'm Gia Mirando, Director of Marketing here at Data IQ, and I'm thrilled to introduce Greg as he discusses the workforce of the future and how we might design new roles to address how we can conceive, create, and consume automated or semi-automated decisions. Thanks so much for joining us today, Greg.
Thanks for having me.
So before I pass the floor over to Greg to dive in, I wanted to share a bit about his many accomplishments. Greg Nelson is the AVP of Analytics Services at Intermountain Healthcare, where he leads analytics product management, data science, and analytics engineering, and has responsibility for the long-term data and analytics strategy for the organization. Prior to joining Intermountain, he has served in executive leadership roles in healthcare, management consulting, and consumer research. In addition, Greg has a passion for people development and has served as adjunct faculty at Duke University's School of Business, NC State University's Institute for Advanced Analytics, and as an expert for the International Institute for Analytics. Greg is also the author of the book, The Analytics Lifecycle Toolkit, which provides managers with a practical manual for integrating data management and analytic technologies into their organization. So without further ado, Greg, I'm going to pass the floor to you.
Thank you. Let me see if I can get the presentation sharing. Okay, can you see the presentation?
Should be coming up shortly.
Let me try resharing.
Yep.
All right, see if that works.
We are good to go.
Okay. Well, thanks for having me in this podcast. I'm super excited to be able to talk about a couple of things that are really passionate to me. Technology, certainly the interface with computers and humans. And you'll see in this picture one of our providers finishing up an interview with one of the new data scientists on our team. Just kidding. So when we talk about the workforce of the future, it's really about thinking long-term as to how we can imagine how this world will fundamentally change in the future. Gia talked a little bit about my background, and it's kind of I'm one of those strange ducks in the sense that I have a long and varied history. I started out my career as a social psychologist, and sort of finalized my career through a number of touch points. And I think that that's important because it really reflects on the biases that we all accumulate as part of our career. And some of these biases, I think, have formed this particular interest of mine in how the intersection of technology, humans, and how we make decisions is manifesting itself in organizations. One of the things that I'm really passionate about is healthcare. We have such opportunity to make a difference in this industry. And I think the opportunities or the promise of AI and analytics in healthcare are long and varied, certainly, from detecting sleep apnea just based on the sound of someone's voice to detecting cancer. And we see these headlines that are a little bit sensational. Being able to detect pneumonia better than radiologists. And I'll talk about some of the hype and some of the reality in healthcare. And then being able to, of course, predicting, mental health issues. And so for me, this is such an exciting place to be. We do find ourselves in a bit of a challenging industry. And a lot of people, when they learn about healthcare, they're saying, this is too hard. Let's go back to marketing, or let's go back to supply chain, or let's go back to fintech. The problems are hard because the environment in which we serve is very difficult. We don't have, for example, a universal identifier for people. And so we end up having to create those. And we have a myriad of players in the healthcare system, which make this really, really complicated. So for a lot of reasons, healthcare is hard. And I think we've oftentimes used that as is an excuse to some extent to say why we can't do better. And so, but I'll point to probably the bigger reason is the risks are really impactful, right? The risks of getting any of these algorithmic decisions wrong are high, and the impact could be life or death. And so I think it's one of those backdrop pieces that we have to look at when we look at how do we deploy AI at scale to really achieve what we want to do. And so I want to point to one example, and you probably heard about this if you've been following the news at all. One of the quotes that I cited earlier, with one of the news headlines I quoted earlier, talks about, well, AI is better than a pathologist. And we get pretty good accuracy if we just use a pathologist alone. We take a patient, we pull a sample, we create tissue blocks, create slides out of those, and a pathologist reads those. And we get about 96.5% accuracy when we do that. AI, and this is where we sort of go a little bit sideways, we say, well, AI is better, right? And so we've improved our accuracy just by software alone. But the reality is, and where I think we will need to focus our attention, is not replacing human intelligence, but rather augmenting it. And so this is a study that was done a couple of years ago, and they looked at when you combine both the pathologist and the software, we end up with amazing improvements in accuracy. And it might not seem like much, but the risks of getting it wrong are so high that we need to get this level of accuracy in order to be able to be reliable and trustworthy in our organizations. So when I think about that as a category of AI, I view this as kind of a continuum, and this continuum sits on one end is where we're using technology and analytics to help us analyze the situation. Sometimes we refer to those as, that's the hard work of statisticians and data analysts and data engineers. And then as we move down that hierarchy, we go from analyzing to let's do proactive alerting, and let's go ahead and implement advisements, and of course that automation level. And as we think about these as that continuum of human independence, what role does the human play in those decisions? We go from complete human independence to autonomous AI, where AI is actually making the decisions. And it's easy for us to recognize in the world of automobiles sort of some examples of where these live. For example, GPS, we can choose to absolutely ignore our GPS. We may make a U-turn when you are able, but we can absolutely make that independence known. As we move down to autonomous AI, this is where we get into self-driving cars and emergency braking and automatic parking, where the human can be basically taken mostly out of the picture, and the risks are fairly high. And so I think this is an opportunity for us to recognize that we need to learn from our technology partners and those that are paving the way in this. I wanted to provide some context in the world of HR. Human resources is not the example, but healthcare rather. We think about healthcare in this same hierarchy, right? So human independence, we analyze lots and lots of data, and we look at things like average cost of care, average length of stay, retrospective report cards or benchmarks. But if we think about how we get to an autonomous AI, there's some really great examples. For example, the FDA back in late 2018, approved the first software as a solution for use to be able to diagnose diabetic retinopathy. And that becomes really, really important because not only can they diagnose diabetic retinopathy by looking at the information, we can also say what's next best action. And this next best action is let's schedule something for that patient right away, where we take some of the human elements out of that. Where we're seeing a lot of work is intelligent automation that sort of sits in the middle of this as we gain trust and confidence in data to help augment those decisions. It's becoming more and more important that we learn how to do this really well. This is a quote from Chris Ross at the Mayo Clinic, and I think it's how we're thinking about data and analytics and where does AI fit into this. And he talks about Generation Next. And what he says is Generation Next ought to be the system of intention, insight, and cognition. Systems that know what we want, help us see what we otherwise wouldn't see, and help us think. And I think that's the really interesting opportunity that we have in healthcare, is to find what are those opportunities as we explore Generation Next. We know that healthcare is a little bit behind in other industries. We're certainly not as advanced as digital first organizations or fintech or insurance tech, or certainly Silicon Valley. And so we know that we're playing a little bit of catch up in healthcare, how we apply AI. And so when we think about AI, we do a lot of reports, and I would argue, there's probably too many reports, too many dashboards, too much information that's being just sent to people for them to consume. And the way I think about this is, as we move from systems of insight, so dashboards and reports are systems of insight, where we're taking people out of their workflow, out of their normal course of action, and we're actually putting them into another system to be able to look at data, analyze data, synthesize data, and then go back into their workflow to make that intervention or decision happen. And so we think about moving from systems of insight to system of engagement. It means necessarily moving some of these elements, quite frankly, into the workflows. And that's how we think about AI. And so the question becomes, where do we focus intelligent automation? Should it be in that early phase where we manage data, consume data, collect, ingest, transform, persist, and report? Or should we be using AI to detect anomalies and help people decide on next best action and recommender systems? And that's really the question that I think is in front of us today as we think about our long-term strategy. And so for us, it's not a question of which one, it's a question of and how do we do that, and how do we partner? We know that, I love this quote from Gartner because I think it challenges us to think differently about how we do this work. And what they suggest as a trend is that more than 40% of all the tasks that we do in data science are going to be automated. And so the question, if you look on the right-hand side, is would we rather automate that stuff in A, or would we rather automate the stuff in B? And I think the question really sits at the intersection of you can't outsource thinking. And so we can analyze automatically, we can look for detections, but the decision to make the action right now, at least in healthcare for most of our business cases, are sitting with, let's automate the boring stuff. Let's automate the data management. Let's automate the integration and the data quality, and let's figure out how do we actually use AI appropriately for the what I'll call the B items, right? And those are the big bold ideas that we began to assemble. So in my book, I talk a lot about analytics as a team sport. There's such a myriad of disciplines that can come together to really help us understand how to do this work really, really well. Oftentimes we end up with a project, and this is just an example project, where we have a business analyst doing the problem definition. We might have them also participating in the data sense making. And we then make sure that business analyst is at the point where we're actually deploying models and measuring their benefit and value for the organization. But the BA can't do that alone, right? So we need data engineers that help us understand what that looks like, and data analysts play a significant role in that process. Certainly data scientists and DevOps, and the list goes on, right? This is just a sampling of some of those roles. And imagine, though, that this is one project and we want to be able to do 1,000. And so that's the problem at scale that we're really trying to solve, is how do I take these pipelines of thinking and technology and data integration, model development, model management, and monitoring, and do that at the scale that we needed to do. And that's really the crux of some of the challenges that we face. The other thing that I'll point out here is the bottom elements, which is we also have all this context going on in the analytics lifecycle. We've got to make sure we're building and reusing knowledge, we're collaborating well, we're managing our source code and technology and business rules in a way that we can reuse those. We've got to figure out what of those 1,000 things that might be going on at once, what do we prioritize? How do we engage stakeholders? How do we make sure that we can be agile and transparent, that we improve team processes, we do quality reviews, and the list goes on. So the question becomes, how do we do this at scale? And those are some of the things I think about, especially in light of some of the challenges that we have, quite frankly, with recruiting those really high-end data science skill sets. I want to talk a little bit about how the industry, in my mind, has shifted some of the responsibility. If we look on the bottom of the slide, we see sort of that classic, we have data structures. How do we store data, right? That takes into account how we ingest data, how do we transform it or move it, persist it, and then we've got to have data preparation. That could be a makerspace for analytics professionals where they're going to blend data from different sources, or it could be more production data marts or data warehouses. And so the other piece is in the self-service, I think we've done our customers, the users of analytics, almost a disservice by talking about self-service when we weren't prepared to deal with the cultural and data literacy and data governance aspects of some of these things. Ultimately, of course, we hope to get to this point of decision intelligence. So if we look at what happened in the early 90s, most of this was managed by what we call the supply side of analytics, those who supply the data and analytic technologies to support the decisions. And we weren't even, for many organizations, we weren't even thinking about auto ML or embedded process or automated insights. I will say one of the projects we did 25 years ago in the telecom industry was really about taking likely to churn and putting that back into case management systems. So it's been going on for a long time. The question is it done at scale on widespread use? In the 2000s, we began to change some of the dynamics a little bit, where we started to focus our efforts on the supply side, where we could deliver now data instead of we had to do all the work and all the analysis. We began to shift that to the demand side. That is, those that are demanding its use in the organization. And we delivered that through buckets of data. And we think about wheelbarrows or buckets of data that we take and we sort of dump them on their front doorstep. We're still not to the point where we're getting actionable insights embedded into the business, where that hard work of analysis and synthesis still being done at the point of interaction is separate from where we embed those flows. I think we're getting better. We start to see supply side shrink a little bit, that we're freeing our data. We call it data democratization, where people are being able to do more and more work in the demand side. And now we start to introduce wide-scale adoption of analytics for intervention. And this is, I think, this was a pivotal transition in the industry. And then finally, I think where we're at is just moving that, right? And so the question becomes, have we shifted the responsibility to the analysis and synthesis and deciding what intervention should be taken to the business? And is self-service just another way of us saying, yeah, we don't know what you want, so let's just give you all the data in these buckets, and we're going to change the modality, right? And so instead of wheelbarrows of data, we're just going to deliver it in different ways. And I think we have to recognize that there's a number of incentives at play. As a recovering social psychologist, I like to talk about incentive structures at play. And so I think when we talk about self-service, we've got to figure out what are the incentives, what needs to happen on the demand side, and what needs to happen on the supply side. This is a diagram that I talked about in my book, which is really about how do we, how do we move from the problem space to the solution space? And I don't think we spend enough time nearly in the problem space, really being able to think about how big is the problem, who does it affect, what causes this problem, what does success look like, how will we operationalize that? And I think engaging business users, clinical users, and others in that space early on, and talking about what does good look like, what does success look like, I think we have a better opportunity to see advancements and actually adoption of some of those things. I think every other organization is plagued with this notion of products that die, right? And so if we deliver a report, is it being used? Is it being used every day? Is it being used by more than one person? Are we being able to deliver, translate our analytic resources into things that matter at scale for organizations? And I think if we can focus a little bit of time on this problem space and introduce concepts like design thinking that help us do problem framing, then we go into some of the skill sets that we talk about with traditional analytics professionals. And so we kind of overlay, if you will, some of the thinking that we need to start introducing into our analytic workforce. And I would say it's there. It's there. Many of these concepts are absolutely embedded in as part of the DNA of these professionals. But I view it as almost the exception, and we call these unicorns, right? When all of a sudden we start to get people with all of these particular skill sets, this is not how we think about typical data analysts, right? People who know and appreciate human-centered design, for example, someone that has that experiment mindset. How are we going to know? How are we going to test? Statistical thinking, critical thinking, logical thinking, product thinking, and certainly in healthcare, we pay a lot of attention to responsible AI and ethical thinking. And so the question becomes, how do we build this at scale so that it can be part of every product that we take to market in our organization, rather than that be based on the heroic efforts of a few individuals? I would also say that we're seeing perhaps a shift in expectations. We're expected to do more and more in our organizations. We think about data and analytics as traditional analysis kind of folks, right? And so they acquire data, they make sense of the data, they help visualize it, they begin to understand under what conditions that occurs. And we've oftentimes thought of the business as doing that synthesis. I'm going to take that bucket of data and I'm going to assemble it with other buckets of information that I have, whether it's structured data or unstructured data, and begin to make sense of that world. And I think the expectation that we often see is that data and analytics professionals are being asked to do more and more of that synthesis work. If we think about being able to provide technologies that aid our analytic caregivers in that process, what we end up doing is providing the expectations around curated insights, where we take and assemble information and deliver it in a way that's consumable by our executive staff, for example. That would be a good example of curated insights. Automated insights, where we deliver insights before anyone asked for it. Did you know that we had an 8% rise in COVID cases in the last 2 days? Without somebody having to analyze that data and look at it, we could identify those and report those out. Now, I use that as an example of COVID. That's a really important example in today's healthcare landscape, because we need to be able to make adjustments to capacity management and where beds and staff are being allocated. And so this becomes almost a right for us to do business in 2020. We have to adapt to this. Certainly recommender systems, the example that I gave around the patient's next action. So you've been diagnosed, what should we do? What is the best next course of action? Anomaly detection, certainly, again, the expectations are rising for what DNA, data and analytics professionals ought to do. And this is an area we're spending a lot of really interesting time on, which is what we call anticipatory insights, which is we know it's important to the organization, we know it's important to leaders. Can we look at the leading indicators early warning signs, the canary in the coal mine, so to speak, of those kinds of things. And so we move from self-service, which is let someone play with the data, to silver service. And I think we're blending that concept of what is the role of the data and analytics professional to provide that higher level of service and touch. Now, we're doing this in the context of shrinking margins and lowering operational costs. And so the question becomes, how do we do this at scale? And intelligent automation is certainly one of the ways that we're thinking about doing that. In really, I think the key here is that we have this analytics lifecycle, and people get very excited about what they do in that space. Me being one of them. I spent most of my career on the left-hand side of this, where we do problem framing, we try to understand, we observe, we contextualize, we bring data together, and we get to develop really cool models and data products. What I think is important for us to remember as we think about the analytics lifecycle is that its job is to support the decision lifecycle. We must figure out how to get better at being inside that decision lifecycle instead of just being a supporting cast. And I think that's an important concept that helps inform what kind of people we'll need in the future, what kind of staff, and what does that workforce of the future represent for us. And so if we take the critical competencies that we saw in that earlier slide, whole problem thinking, technical fluency, behavioral economics, and we start to take those competencies of our traditional data and analytics competencies to help support improvements in the decision lifecycle, I think we're going to be able to help transform organizations. Unfortunately, what I often see happening in organizations, you have the IT folks, sometimes the analytic folks, talking about self-service. And I love this analogy. This was I don't know if he created it, but a colleague of mine said it, and I just thought it was really apt. What we're asking people to do with self-service is akin to asking them to use a vending machine when what they have right now is a home chef. And so we can't think about that. And I think we need to design different ways to communicate that value and change the incentives. And this is where I think behavioral economics becomes really important, is we've got to rethink how we talk about that. It's not simply a way to say, go fish for yourself so we can do other things. It's let's do different things for you by automating some of that boring stuff. The other thing that I think is challenging for most organizations is data governance, right? And it often comes across as the rules and regulations, what you can't do, how do we protect information, as opposed to how do we free it, how do we use it. And finally, we're really, really good about talking about data platforms, and we get super excited when it comes to Spark and Scala, and I won't mention specific vendor names, but the idea is that we get super excited about the technologies we use, and we love them because they're part of our tool set that enables us to be successful with our business customers. I would say some of this language is really creating this barrier between us and the customer because it reduces trust. There have been several occasions in my career where business folks have said, look, I don't understand what you're talking about. And it's a great reminder for us to empathize and to figure out what is it that they need and how do they need it, how do they consume it in a way that is going to match the incentive structure that they're operating on, not the ones that we get excited about. And it's often a hard reminder. And I was reminded actually with a call with one of our ELT measures, this AI stuff is really cool, it's bright and shiny, but what we need you to do is help us solve X. And so we've got to create tighter linkage with understanding what X is and not get so excited about sharing how we're going to do it with technology language. And I think we have an opportunity to do there to get better. I think when we look at this and we look at, like most organizations, we want the cream of the crop. I read an interesting statistic a couple of weeks ago where they said, what we're seeing in the marketplace was that they're getting a lot of new entrants into data science. You're getting a lot of people coming out of master's degree programs that aren't experienced. And how does that dynamic impact what we really need in our workforce, which is a lot of coaches and a lot of babysitters and a lot of people who can communicate and prioritize for some of those younger teams? That's going to be a challenge for us. I'll also point to these two stats, which I think are important and certainly top of mind as we think about the workforce of the future, which is the importance of soft skills. A lot of times what we talk about is the ability to understand a problem, the ability to rearticulate priorities, the ability to communicate and influence are all critically important skills. And there was a LinkedIn Global Talent Trend survey done in 2019 that talked about 92% of leaders said soft skills are as important or more important than technical skills, or what we call hard skills. But also you then translate that into, well, it's also really hard to teach. And that's the statistic on the right-hand side, where 93% of managers said technical skills are just easier to teach, right? And so is it a crisis that we would look to, do we just try to influence our talent pipeline? Do we to make the interview process less burdensome? Do we consider different models of employment, such as telework? And I think the answer to that is we need to be always thinking about how do we solve that fundamental problem. But you'll look at the interesting quote at the bottom. 89% of the folks said that when a new hire doesn't work out, it's mostly because they lack those soft skills. So while we're turning out people with masters and PhDs in data science and statistics and quantitative methods, what we're not doing is a very good job at turning out people that have the ability, the organizational gravitas to be able to be successful in organizations. And so the way that we're thinking about this is not novel to us, but it's certainly something that we're putting to action today in our organization, which is creating an entirely new job family around the role of the decision intelligence analyst. And the idea is that it's someone who can do this really well, understand a problem, analyze it, synthesize it, validate it at scale, and being able to have those interactions with diverse data and content, understand the importance of responsible AI, be able to tell these dynamic data stories, ultimately getting us to this faster time to decision concept. So it's going to be someone that probably doesn't exist in nature, right? It's someone who understands quantitative, statistical, algorithmic, management science, decision science, social psychology, behavioral economics, at scale, right? And so that's really what we're trying to move this job family towards. Is we're not giving up our data analysts, we're not giving up our data engineers, we're not giving up our data managers, but we're instead saying, look, we need something else because what we're doing is not going to allow us to scale organizationally. And so some of the competencies that we think about, we talk about a competency pyramid here. We have personal characteristics, their ability to communicate or influence or understand. And then there's aptitude, those innate qualities that help us become successful in the organization. Then there's all the things like skills and knowledge that can be learned and developed. And, we think a lot of what we can teach, I can teach data wrangling, I can teach data visualization, I can even teach data science. What I can't always teach is problem solving and critical thinking, and being able to combine multiple concepts. I can't always help think about how do we help people use different mental models to frame their thinking, and how do we get better at thinking. But that's our challenge, right? And so, I always say it's one of the things I can't teach is curiosity, but I can teach most anything else. And so that's what we're looking for in those personal characteristics and aptitudes, and then really focusing on how do we build that next gen workforce of the future. And I think it's super exciting. And we're also not doing this in a vacuum. The Aberdeen group has a quote out of a recent white paper that I really like, which talks about users, business users, the demand side of analytics, are demanding that capabilities are delivered in context where they work with a better framework of how and why that insight is important, as well as to how it should be used or can be used. We have an amazing team of folks that have put together some really interesting, creative, highly curated data products for our executive leaders across the organization in response to COVID. But it requires time and energy, and it just requires a massive analysis and synthesis of literally thousands of data points, over 280 dashboards, external data sources, research that's going on in the world. And twice a week, we synthesize that and deliver that curated insight. It's that level of insights that I think we need to get really, really good at delivering at scale. And this is one of the roles that I think is going to help us do that. And so we talk about analytic personas. We have data scientists, certainly. We have data consumers. We have continuous improvement folks and data stewards. And one of the roles, one of the personas that we're building out is this decision intelligence analyst, which will be core to this advancement opportunity for us. And these are the strengths that you might imagine, right? So curiosity, analytical thinking, being able to do consulting, storytelling, really organized, being able to pull things together in a myriad of ways. And I think it's going to be fun. I think it'll be really exciting for people to think about how they can make impacts in organizations. We do have an upscaling strategy because we know we're not going to necessarily be able to find these folks. But we want to be able to aspire, that is, create a vision, articulate what does that look like in our organization, what do the competency models look like, and how do we select those folks? And then that necessarily informs how we hire, how we do succession planning, and then how we measure their success. And so we're building out on the strategy today, and as part of that is developing our own curriculum. We don't see where we're going to be able to use external curriculum for a lot of this content. We're going to have to build it ourselves, which is okay, because we need to be able to do this and we can't wait. And so that's some of the challenges that we'll face. And so as I think about the competencies, it really does shift what we end up looking for. We talk about analytic unicorns or data science unicorns. And for me, what's really fun is, yes, I spent the first part of my career on the right-hand side of this screen. I love it. I love software development. I love data analysis and exploration and data visualization. But the folks who are going to be successful in these kinds of roles that help us embed insights into organizations are going to be the things on the left-hand side. Understanding of technical fluency, understanding of what AI is, what's possible with AI, but not necessarily have to know how to implement a model in Python. That's going to be that bridge role that we see is so critically important. So as I think about some of the closing thoughts and key takeaways, I think human-centered design is one of the cornerstones that we will use to build out our data products. How we design interventions. And I heard one of your previous speakers from Airbnb talk about, what that data product looks like, and really admire what other industries are doing, and how do we take that and we build that into healthcare insights that are embedded in workflows. We need to make sure we understand those workflows. We need to understand the people and the personas and the tasks that they have to do, and how this fits into their whole problem. I think we've got to get really good at that. I think analytical thinking is one of those things we really, it's hard to select for. It's hard to find people, and you have it, but you don't necessarily have a good test for it. And so I think that's one of the things we need to get really, really good at, is if people don't have it, we need to figure out how to coach them and do better. The analogy I'll give there is, it's easy to say, go, from a basketball player on pointers. I can say that all day long. It doesn't mean they're going to get better at it unless I really commit to coaching them along that journey. And that's what I think we need to be focused on. the product mindset, where we have products that are durable, that have value at scale. Again, really core to part of what we're doing. And then the last, a plug for the social psychologist and behavioral economists in the room, which is we need to understand how people think and how we present information, and how it gets framed in our data products. So I think this is a fun topic. We're looking for collaborators in the industry, across other industries as well, as we think about how do we build these competencies, and we don't have to do it ourselves, right? So we want to figure out how do we get to scale quickly with people who don't necessarily fit that traditional data science mindset. So Gia, thank you for the opportunity, and I'll turn it over to you for any questions that may have arisen.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Greg. This has been a really fascinating talk. You've left everyone with so many incredible points to ponder and think about. So we've got a lot of great questions that came in, so I will dive right in. This question is from Taylor. If you had to make the choice to hire either someone with business domain expertise or someone with deep analytical skills, who would you hire and why?
Yeah, it's a great question. So Taylor, I think in healthcare it's hard because you can't always say, well, they don't need healthcare experience because healthcare is complicated. We talked about that, right? Understanding the data, understanding the workflows, understanding how patient care is delivered and the digital exhaust that gets created of that is complicated. On the other side, it's really great to have good, strong data scientists who can help translate. And I'm a data guy, and I wasn't always in healthcare, so I know it can be learned. I say you have to look for aptitude and analytical thinking, statistical thinking, whole problem thinking, systems thinking as those elements. And if you can find somebody that understands your domain or subdomain, right? So in healthcare, we have supply chain, we have HR, we have clinical care, all acting as the subdomains. I don't think it's an either or. I think you have to really focus on the right person with the right aptitudes to be able to take on those roles.
Yeah, absolutely. That flows nicely into another question that we have that ties into the title of your talk as well. You mentioned that building soft skills is challenging. How do you develop those without running into the same issues that we have in finding experienced data scientists? And then said, aren't you just looking for different unicorns?
Yeah, I think it's a different population, and maybe I'm biased, right? So I came out of grad school, and I was running around Silicon Valley looking for a job as a social psychologist. And, they wanted engineers, they wanted software and computer people, they wanted firmware, they wanted ceramic engineers. I remember, but sorry, do you have a ceramic engineering background? And so I felt a little bit like, oh my gosh, I've just wasted, so many years of education. But I think the reality is one of the opportunities that data science revolution has created is we see data scientists that are coming from all walks of life, all professions, not just computer science or statistics. And that's, to me, exciting. I saw somebody on LinkedIn the other day said, I'm a French major and a data scientist, right? And so we're seeing this really now there's downsides to that, right? So not everybody comes to the table with those underlying quantitative skills that are critically important. I'm a social psychologist, but an experimental social psychologist, which means lots of quantitative statistics as part of my background. But again, I think my belief is that we can teach those things. We can't teach someone how to think. And so I think we're going to see, I've met folks that are physicists that are data scientists, and certainly the French major is an example. I'm a social psychologist. I think we need to look broader. And when we do, that opens up that possibility of being able to attract a lot more people.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And let's see, our next question is from Katie. So you talked about the product mindset and how we can design data products that are more human-centered. Can you talk about how you're doing that?
Yeah. Part of what we end up doing in analytics is responding to inquiry, right? And so many of our analytic caregivers are, just like many organizations, are very customer-centric. They want to solve the customer's problem. But it's really a shift in thinking about how to ask questions, right? And how do we frame the question that customer just asked us in a way that's not only going to solve their problem, but potentially solve other problems at the same time for more people. And that's really the shift. It's not so much on output, but rather outcome. And that's the mindset that we're building. We're building literacy programs around the product mindset, giving a talk internally in a couple of weeks to our analytics community. We're building product management functions that have analytic product managers who will be responsible. We'll have a product manager that's responsible for our ED, for example, one that's going to be responsible for our self-service technologies. Again, it's that product mindset. It's not coming from, we have a bunch of technology, wouldn't you like to use it? It's, we've thought about your problem, we've thought about your journey, we thought about the problems that you're trying to face, and let's come to the table with a solution that addresses that whole problem thinking.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. See, question from Guy. What about information processing training for actual employees with the qualities we need and we know they have?
I'm not exactly sure what the question is. Let me see if I can reframe it. So like most organizations, it's a complex myriad web of data flowing throughout the organization. So there's information captured. That data sometimes will be enhanced in source systems. Sometimes it moves to data warehouses and data marts and continues to flow down the pipeline to self-service technologies, to dashboards. Ultimately, we hope get back into insights that are embedded back in that original workflow. In healthcare, probably more than most industries, there's large groups that focus on interoperability and standards, around how do we communicate, what a lab value should look like. Those understanding of the complex interoperability requirements, the data standards, how we talk to them, I think we can teach. We have some of the best scientists in the world who that sit on boards that talk about interoperability, for example. So we've got faculty in-house that can teach those skills. We just need to focus them on the right things. I think that's what you're asking. I think technical fluency is probably one of the more important skills, rather than getting so deep in one technology and becoming entrenched in that and loving it. We know the technologies we use today in 10 years are not going to look the same. And so if we want our careers to be durable, we need to be thinking differently about how we hold on to technology and begin to think about what technology is going to help me solve this problem. And it may not be the way I used the technology in the past.
Mm-hmm. So I think we have time for a few more. We have a question from Erica with regards to behavior economics. Why do you think that is important in analytics?
So I love behavioral economics. Admittedly, one of my bias, and I said this up front, that I'm a recovering social psychologist, and I think that's fun to try to understand why people do the things they do, why they make the decisions they do, and recognizing that what behavioral economics is about is understanding what incentives are at play, what are the economics of entrenched beliefs, for example, or I use this data because I look like a hero to my boss, which is probably contrarian to what their boss wants them to do, right? If we can automate that, we can deliver it in a way, but we've got to not dismiss those incentives because they're core to who people are and how they end up behaving. So as analytics professionals, I think it's incumbent upon us to understand that incentives are at play, try to understand and tease those out during our interview processes with people as we're discovering new opportunities. But yeah, it's an exciting space, and I encourage everybody to go out. There are a number of books and resources I'm happy to share if you reach out to me afterwards on what I think some of the better opportunities are.
That's great. All right, one more question. So how do you see the concept of digital twins? Is it useful for many use case scenarios?
Tobias, great question. I'm not sure I understand the term digital twin, so I'm not going to even try to answer that question. I can make something up, but admittedly, I'm ignorant on the subject.
All right. Well, Greg, we're nearing the end of our session. Do you have any final thoughts that you would like to leave the audience with?
So, as we think about the workforce of the future, one of the things that occurs to me is that, going back to incentives, as we think about the people who do these roles today, and we've seen the shift in dynamics on the supply side and the demand side happen over time. We could go into a Lowe's, for example, a home improvement store, and we probably see a tenth of the number of employees that we did even 5 to 10 years ago. In data science, we'll continue to automate where we can. Automate the boring stuff is what one of our mantras, right? And so the question becomes, how do I future-proof my skill set? And it's learning about things that not necessarily come natural to you. There's this fallacy, and I'll call it a fallacy. I know that there are many industries that have gone through this. So, for example, if you were in the horse carriage business, you probably, didn't fare very well when the automobile came out. Or, if you were cutting ice in lakes and shipping it to cities in coaches so that people could have refrigerated items in their house, you're probably, there's disruptive technology that occurs. But the fallacy that I talk about is this notion of technological unemployment, which is, where technology comes in and all of a sudden it introduces this mass unemployment. I think we have to figure out how do we move beyond the ways that we're thinking about old problems and try to figure out how do we solve problems at scale. And so it's a shift in mindset and an opportunity for many of us to grow and to learn new things. The other thing that I'll share, and I think the analogy is apt, there's something called the sailing ship effect. It's known by a couple of other names, but the idea is that very little innovation occurred in the wooden shipbuilding industries, for almost 200, 300 years. It wasn't until steam ships made out of metal hulls began to be introduced that the massive innovation that occurred in sailing vessels occurred as a result of that. So it wasn't displaced by it. And I think we're going to see this in data science. I'm really excited about it. I'm convinced that it is going to be the impetus. Instead of viewing automated insights as, oh, wait, somebody's going to take my job. Instead of viewing automated data matching algorithms that it's going to take my job because I'm a data engineer, it's, gosh, look at this opportunity for me to think about how do I transform what I do into very different ways. So I'd like to leave my contact information. I encourage folks to reach out to me. Would love to collaborate around this masterclass we're developing and how you think about the workforce of the future and what skills are going to be important. So thank you, Gia.
Yeah. Thank you. Slightly echo. Sorry, everyone. This is a strange echo that we seem to be experiencing. Hopefully it will stop. But thank you again, Greg. This has been an incredibly insightful talk. And thank you to all of you who have joined us live. As Greg said, I think we're going to be sharing his contact information. And while we get that up, I also wanted to invite all of you to tune into our next Egg on Air live streams. We have many coming up. We're running them on a weekly or bi-weekly basis. So some of the ones that are coming up now are Janelle Shea will be talking about what AI can and can't do on November 5th. Nicole Alexander on November 10th will dive into explainable AI. And on November 12th, Santo Fortebuono will be discussing maximizing impact with self-service analytics. So until next time, everyone. Oh, and there's Greg's contact information. Thanks, everyone.